When you first create a Node.js code step, you may be a little confused by the structure, why it says define component at the top, and why there's a run function, and what are the $ and steps variables that are passed to it. Well, this video is all about learning about all those things and how they're not so complicated after all. Starting with a brand new workflow, I'm not even going to bother creating a trigger because this is all about learning about Node.js code steps. So I'm going to add a brand new code step, choosing Node and just running code. And you can see here that there is the definition of a component. The default export is this function called define component. That's what we're doing. We're defining a component to run within this code step. The run function is what's called when this step is running. So the contents of this function are where you want to define the code you want to be executed. And you'll notice that it is async. So you can run asynchronous code that can await for promises. For example, you can await an API call with Axios or any kind of third-party library that returns a promise. Let's remove our Axios call here, and let's talk about the two variables that are passed as arguments to the run function. The first is steps, which is called the step exports. All of the data that is exported by steps above this current Node.js step will be available in the steps object. You can watch our past video to learn more and see an actual example of this being used. The second variable, the $, you can think of as utilities. So we can do things like modify the particular flow, the workflow, or flow for short. So we could do things like delay the workflow for a certain number of milliseconds. So if we wanted to pause it for 1 second, we type in 1000 as an argument. We can also exit the flow early. This will completely stop the workflow, and we pass it a reason. We say, just because, in this particular case. This will cause the entire workflow to end. If you would like to only skip this particular step, you can just return, and that will cause anything below this line to be skipped. There are other utilities besides altering the workflow itself. We can enter in the $ again, and we can see that there's an export utility. This will also export a variable. It takes in 2 arguments. First is the key. So we could say name, and we could pass in a value, which will export that into the step exports. You can think of it as a way to export multiple variables instead of just one variable. If we want to only export one variable from this particular Node.js step, all we have to do is return it. So in this case, we will see 2 different exports coming from this step by clicking test. And below you can see in the results panel, I exported 2 different variables. One was the return value because I returned a string with the contents of hi, and the other is a named export that I chose the name as the key. All right, let's delete all that. What else is there? We can also look at the .respond method. We didn't add a trigger to this workflow, but if it was an HTTP webhook workflow, then we could respond with an HTTP response to the initial client. So long story short, we could define a body, and we could say any kind of JSON message, workflow completed, for example, and we could define a HTTP status, and this will actually send a response to the initiating webhook that started this whole workflow. Let's see what else we have under the $. We have send, which are called destination helpers. Destination helpers are a little bit different in that they do not alter the execution of the workflow. They're kind of like sent in a side track, and the workflow will continue as normal, but these send destinations will send requests like emails, emit special events, which I'll go into later, HTTP requests. You can upload files, and you can even send server-side events, or SSE for short. And that covers all of the common uses of the $ utilities. Let's go into a different type of parameter that you can't see by default, but we'll cover in detail later, but you should know the basics of now, which are called props. So props we define at the top level here outside of the run function, and these are special arguments that we can use to generate values at runtime. What do I mean by that? So you probably saw this in pre-built actions where you could pass in a value in a special field at the very top of the step. Let's do that here. So let's define that this particular prop is a name and its type is a string. Because name is typically text, that's a pretty good call. So I'll click this button over here to refresh the fields. And sure enough, it creates a name field that should evaluate to a string because we decided the type is a string. Now, instead of using the steps exports, we can actually type in names like this. So you can define a name, and then we could do this dot name because the name of our prop is name. Let's just return this so we can show that it affects the step exports. So I'll click test, and we should see the name Dylan being exported as the return value of this current step. And look at that. Now you can see how you can use props instead of using steps and how it's accessible under the this dot scope. In future videos, I'm going to teach you how the same exact component structure you just learned applies to building your own custom triggers and actions within the Pipedream ecosystem.